cleaning lady whispered in French, "Don't drink that." And the millionaire freezes. The vast Whitmore estate stood quietly on the edge of a wooded hill in Connecticut, bathed in the mellow light of late autumn. Its grandeur, though undiminished by time, now seemed more like a relic of an era past than a home actively lived in. Since retiring from the pharmaceutical empire he had built over 4 decades, Charles Whitmore had embraced solitude with a precision not unlike the way he once ran board meetings. At 74 years old, with snow-white hair and a posture that still retained an echo of command, he had traded business forecasts for daily walks, corporate dinners for solitary breakfasts, and market analyses for handwritten pages of personal reflection. Each morning began the same way. At precisely 7 o'clock, the kitchen would stir with the faint aroma of freshly ground coffee, which Charles prepared himself. He took it black, always in the same porcelain mug etched with the initials C.W. gifted to him on his 50th birthday by the company's board of directors. Afterward, he would sit at the breakfast nook near the eastern window and watch as the forest beyond his lawn shifted colors with the seasons. His estate staff was minimal by choice: one groundskeeper who came twice a week, a cook who prepared his weekly meals in advance, and a cleaning lady who arrived every Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. That last presence, the cleaning lady, had only recently entered his routine. She was a soft-spoken woman named Madeline, of French origin, with silvery streaks in her hair and a gaze that saw far more than she ever let on. She never asked questions, never lingered longer than necessary, and moved through the house with the care of someone walking through sacred ground. Charles liked that. He didn't want questions. He had spent a lifetime answering them: investors, journalists, regulators, angry activists. Silence now felt like a long-deserved reward. And yet, there was something about Madeline's quiet efficiency that occasionally disturbed his calm, though he could never pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the way she paused when passing the shelves in his study, her fingers occasionally tracing the spines of the books he had collected over the years. Or the way she glanced, just briefly, at the framed photographs on the mantel, as if searching for someone she once knew. Still, Charles appreciated the steadiness she brought. His days were no longer measured in meetings or flight itineraries, but in paragraphs completed in the memoir he had decided to write, a private account of his life in the pharmaceutical industry. He wrote slowly, deliberately, as though trying to untangle knots he didn't know he had tied. The working title of the manuscript was Margins and Molecules, though he remained unconvinced it would ever see a publisher's desk. By the second month of Madeline's employment, a quiet pattern had formed. She arrived and departed without a sound, and Charles would retreat to his study while she worked. Sometimes they exchanged a polite "good morning" or a nod in passing, but never more. It suited them both. One Thursday morning, the air carried a chill hinting at the first frost. Charles had just finished reviewing the last section of his 3rd chapter when he remembered a bottle of vintage wine given to him years ago by an old colleague. He had stored it in the small cellar beneath the library wing, mostly forgotten until that morning. With no visitors expected and the rest of the day free, he thought it a fine opportunity to open it. The bottle itself was a deep burgundy with a handwritten label in elegant script. Something about it seemed nostalgic, perhaps even sentimental. He brought it up to the kitchen and placed it on the marble counter, studying the label as the early morning light filtered through the windows. Just then, Madeline passed by the threshold, holding a basket of freshly laundered linens. Her eyes flicked to the bottle, and for the briefest moment, something in her expression shifted. She hesitated, then continued on. Charles, absorbed in the label, barely noticed. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and golden light stretched across the tiled floor, Charles reached for the corkscrew. As he poised to open the bottle, Madeline entered quietly to collect the cleaning supplies from the adjoining pantry. She paused near the doorway, then said, almost under her breath, in a voice soft and fluent in her native tongue, "Ne buvez pas assez." Charles's hand froze. He turned slowly, unsure if he had heard correctly. Madeline met his eyes briefly, then looked away, her face unreadable. She gave a polite nod, gathered her things, and exited the room without another word. The room was suddenly still. Charles stared at the bottle in his hand, the corkscrew resting beside it. Her words rang clearly in his mind, words he understood without effort. "Do not drink that." It was not the warning itself that disturbed him, but the calm certainty with which it had been delivered. She had not sounded alarmed. She had sounded certain. Certain, and quietly insistent. For the first time in months, the quiet of the house no longer felt like peace. It felt like a question. A question he had no idea how to answer. The bottle remained on the kitchen counter well into the evening, untouched, casting a long shadow under the amber glow of the overhead lights. Charles didn't move it. He simply sat at the far end of the kitchen table, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes locked on the dark glass, as if expecting it to blink or speak. He replayed Madeline's voice in his mind countless times, each syllable clearer than the last. "Ne buvez pas assez." The phrase clung to the air, refusing to dissolve. He had understood her perfectly. Years ago, in the early stages of expanding his company into Europe, Charles had spent extended periods in Paris. Fluent in business French, he could negotiate deals, read clinical reports, and, clearly, understand a direct warning about wine. Still, what troubled him wasn't the language. It was the moment itself, the strange intimacy of it. Madeline hadn't shouted. She hadn't grabbed the bottle or insisted he stop. She had simply said what she said and left, like someone tossing a key into the sea and walking away. Later that night, Charles placed the bottle gently inside the liquor cabinet in the study and locked it. He wrote the date on a sticky note and attached it to the inside of the cabinet door, just a record for himself, not that he thought he would forget. He had no intention of opening the bottle now. But he also had no intention of discarding it. Not yet. That evening's writing session was a failure. He sat before his notebook, pen in hand, but the words wouldn't come. His thoughts were scattered, his focus stolen by the incident. He was not a man prone to paranoia. Years in the pharmaceutical business had taught him to recognize real threats from imagined ones. Yet there was something unsettling about a gift he never expected. A warning he didn't ask for, and a woman he barely knew delivering it with such quiet urgency. The following morning brought a light fog over the estate, softening the outlines of the trees and turning the garden into a watercolor of muted greens and grays. Charles took his coffee to the porch and sat in his usual spot, watching the mist shift. The questions from the night before lingered, persistent. Who had sent the wine? Why would Madeline warn him? And why in French? His curiosity outweighed his caution. After breakfast, he returned to his study and opened his old address book. He found the name of Leonard Davis, an old colleague, now retired, who had been known for his extravagant tastes and equally extravagant gifts. If anyone might send a bottle of rare wine unannounced, it would be Leonard. Charles dialed the number. A few rings passed before a familiar voice answered, warm and Gravelly. Charles. Been ages. What a surprise. They exchanged pleasantries. Charles asked about Leonard's latest travels, his vineyard. Investments in Sonoma, the health of his wife. Finally, he brought up the bottle. I received a rather elegant bottle of wine recently. Charles said. Burgundy vintage. For some reason, I thought it might be from you. No note, no sender's name. There was a pause. Then Leonard chuckled, not unkindly. Wish I could claim the credit, my friend. But no, not me. Haven't sent anything your way in years. In fact, I owe you a dinner from our last bet. Still owe you, come to think of it. Charles forced a smile, but something inside him tightened. Been a mix-up. I see. Well, no worries. Must've. They said their goodbyes, but the unease had taken root. Leonard was the only person Charles could reasonably suspect. If not him, then who? Later that afternoon, Charles walked to the kitchen and stood once again before the now empty spot where the bottle had been. He opened the cabinet, confirmed it was still there, then closed it carefully. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water and returned to the breakfast nook. As he sat, his thoughts drifted to Madeline. She had never before spoken out of turn. Never commented on anything beyond the most basic courtesies. She was, if anything, invisible in the house, a quiet presence, not a participant. So why that moment? Why that warning? Charles reviewed the memory in detail, her posture, her voice, her glance at the bottle. She had seen something. Not a threat, perhaps, but something she recognized. Her words hadn't carried panic, they carried recognition. By evening, the house had returned to its usual silence. But it no longer felt serene. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows carried weight. Charles felt watched, not in the paranoid sense of being followed or surveilled, but in the subtler, heavier way one feels when an unanswered question sits in the room with you. He returned to his study and opened a blank page in his notebook. Instead of continuing his memoir, he wrote one sentence: "Why did she warn me?" He stared at the words for several minutes, then underlined them slowly. Beneath it, he began a list: possible reasons, connections, explanations. Most were absurd. One, however, lingered: she knows something about the wine. The thought wouldn't leave him. If Madeline knew something, why had she said nothing more? Why had she chosen to speak only in that moment and in her native tongue? Sleep that night came reluctantly, and when it did, it was shallow. Charles woke early, the sky still dark outside. He sat in bed, listening to the low hum of the heater kicking in, the distant hoot of an owl. A man who had built his fortune on facts and data was now wrestling with silence and instinct. The following Thursday, at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Madeline arrived again. Charles waited in the kitchen, already dressed, coffee in hand. When she passed by with her usual greeting, he spoke her name. Madeline. She paused, looked at him politely. I wanted to ask about last week, he said, keeping his tone gentle. Wine. What you said, about the... Her face remained neutral. Yes, Monsieur Whitmore. You told me not to drink it. Why? She held his gaze for a moment longer than usual, then offered a slight, noncommittal smile. Was just a feeling, sir. It. Charles frowned. A feeling? Yes. Sometimes, certain things seem out of place. The label looked odd. The bottle, something about it reminded me of a story I once heard. She turned back toward her. Cleaning supplies. But perhaps it is nothing. Before he could ask more, she disappeared down the hallway. Charles sat back in his chair, heart unsettled. Something told him she wasn't lying. But she wasn't telling the whole truth either. Not yet. For the next several days, the house seemed quieter than usual, though the sounds themselves had not changed. The old wood still creaked at night, the grandfather clock still announced every hour with mechanical precision, and the faint chirping of birds continued in the early morning. But for Charles, something fundamental had shifted. Silence no longer served as comfort, it had become a canvas for suspicion. That single bottle of wine, now sealed behind the liquor cabinet's glass pane, had introduced a fracture in his carefully ordered world. A world he had spent a lifetime constructing with discipline, logic, and control. On Saturday afternoon, after 2 days of deliberation, Charles stood before the cabinet once more. He opened the door slowly and lifted the bottle out with both hands. He examined it again, as though this time it might yield something new. The label, handwritten in elegant script, bore a vintage year from the early 2000s, a region in Burgundy, and what appeared to be the name of a small vineyard. But something about the handwriting struck him now as overly decorative, almost theatrical. He tilted the bottle gently, watching the sediment swirl inside. He had never liked unanswered questions. Back in his study, he set the bottle down on the desk and reached for his personal ledger, a journal of incoming mail, gifts, calls, and visits he had kept for years out of habit. It was a remnant of his executive life, but it had proven useful even in retirement. He flipped through recent entries, searching for anything that might explain the wine's sudden appearance. Nothing. No note about its delivery. No mention of a courier. Just a gap, as if it had materialized on its own. He picked up the phone again, this time calling Judith, his part-time assistant who helped with scheduling, deliveries, and correspondence. She had not been to the house since the wine arrived but might have seen something in the records. "Judith, good afternoon. Quick question for you," he said when she answered. "Do we have any record, recent deliveries, notes, anything about a bottle of wine delivered to me within the last 3 weeks?" She was silent for a moment. "Gate. Did it come through another channel?" "Not that I recall. I log everything that arrives through the main." "I don't believe so. It was just here one day." "Well, that's strange," she said. "You want me to check with the gatehouse logs, just in case?" "Please do," Charles replied. "Let me know if anything turns up." After the call, he stared at the bottle again. For a moment, he considered uncorking it just to examine the scent, the coloration, the clarity. But his hand paused mid-reach. It wasn't fear, it was doubt. A kind of disquiet that ran deeper than instinct. Later that evening, Judith called back. "I checked everything, no entries for a wine delivery, no couriers listed, no packages unaccounted for." "Are you sure it wasn't something you already had?" Charles almost laughed. He knew the contents of his wine collection better than anyone. This bottle was not part of it. And now, it seemed, it had arrived without a trace. After hanging up, Charles returned to the ledger and began to write. He logged the bottle under unverified deliveries. Dated the Thursday before Madeline's warning. As he wrote, his mind turned again to her. Her face had been composed when she spoke, but not empty. There had been something behind her words, an experience, a memory, a recognition. 2 days later, Charles called on an old friend, Peter Langston, a former colleague from his days at Whitmore Therapeutics. Peter had been the company's head of security during a time of heavy regulatory scrutiny, and though now retired, he still maintained an analytical mind and a cautious temperament. Charles invited him for lunch under the pretense of catching up, though he had more specific motives. They met at a quiet bistro in town. Charles explained the situation over the first course, presenting the story with his characteristic precision, each detail cleanly separated from the next, no embellishments. Peter listened closely, occasionally nodding, his eyes narrowing slightly when Charles mentioned Madeline's warning. "You're saying a bottle of wine appeared in your home with no record of delivery," Peter said. "And your cleaning lady told you not to drink it. But you're certain she had no prior slowly knowledge of it?" "She said it was just a feeling," Charles replied. "But I don't believe that." "Neither do I," Peter said. "People don't give warnings like that without a reason." "And you're sure the bottle wasn't already in your collection?" "Positive." Peter leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. "Well, it's either someone wanted you to have that bottle for a reason, or someone wanted you to drink it for a reason. Either way, the delivery being untraceable is the part that worries me." Charles said nothing, but the tightness in his chest confirmed Peter's thoughts echoed his own. The wine, by itself, could be dismissed. The warning could be explained as a misunderstanding. But together they suggested something larger. After lunch, Charles returned to the estate and found himself wandering the halls with restless energy. He walked into rooms he rarely entered, looked inside closets and cabinets, as if expecting to find another clue, something else out of place. But everything remained as it should be, orderly, intact. That night, unable to sleep, he pulled out old employment files from his private archive. These were copies he had kept from his time running the company, organized by department, date, and region. He began scanning the names, unsure of what he was looking for but following the quiet urgency that had now taken hold. Then, quite unexpectedly, he found himself searching the European branch folders, specifically France. The decision was not conscious, it had been pulled from his memory like a thread. Unspooling. There, buried among project evaluations and staffing memos, he found a report referencing a field testing phase conducted in partnership with several hospitals in the Paris region. The file dated back over 20 years. Charles stared at the document, something distant sparking in his mind. He didn't remember every name listed, but he remembered the controversy. The data had come back cleaner than expected, almost too clean. A few members of the board had raised concerns, but nothing concrete ever emerged. He had dismissed it at the time, convinced of the legitimacy of the trial. Now, in the quiet of his study, he wasn't so sure. Not anymore. He closed the file and turned out the light, but the questions followed him into the dark. The next morning, Charles awoke before dawn, his mind still agitated by the fragments of memory stirred by the document he had unearthed the night before. The name of the Paris project lingered with uncomfortable weight, like a chapter he had long tried to forget. The silence of the estate, once his most cherished companion, now seemed to echo his doubt. He dressed in haste, foregoing his usual routine, and walked straight to the study, where the documents remained spread across the desk in quiet accusation. He knew that a proper investigation required clarity, not nostalgia. Facts, not interpretations. That was how he had built his legacy, not by feeling, but by process. And yet, this was different. He couldn't open a case file or order a new audit. He was no longer the man who commanded teams or pulled levers behind corporate curtains. Now, he had only memory and instinct, both of which felt unreliable under the circumstances. Charles sat in his leather chair and began to write a list. Not of names, but of questions. How had the wine entered his home? Why had Madeline warned him? What connection, if any, existed between her and the Paris trials? Why had the file from so many years ago felt familiar, in a way that struck him now as deeply personal? The questions led him to a decision he had avoided until then. He would need help, not from a retired executive or a cautious assistant, but from someone who had worked alongside him. Someone who had touched the details at ground level. There was one name that surfaced. Without hesitation, Alan Hemsley. Alan had been a project coordinator in Europe during the early expansion of Whitmore Therapeutics. He had a sharp mind, a distaste for bureaucracy, and an almost irritating insistence on following procedure to the letter. At the time, Charles had found him both useful and exhausting. But he had trusted him, and Alan had never failed to deliver straight answers, even when the truth was inconvenient. That afternoon, Charles placed the call. Alan answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly but alert. "Alan, it's Charles Whitmore." A pause. "Charles. Well. That's unexpected. How long's it been?" "Too long." Charles replied. "I need a favor. Strictly personal. I need you to help me trace something. A bottle of wine. Possibly connected to someone from the past." The silence on the other end stretched before Alan answered. "All right. Tell me what you know." Charles detailed the situation with precision, including Madeline's cryptic warning, the lack of delivery record, and the file referencing the Paris trials. Alan listened without interruption. When Charles finished, there was another pause. "I remember those trials," Alan said finally. "The board. You sure this woman's connected? Lot of gray areas. Tight turnaround. Pressure from." "I'm not sure of anything," Charles admitted. "But I can't ignore the coincidence." "All right," Alan said. "Give me a few days. I'll make some calls. Still have a few contacts in the European division." As the call ended, Charles felt the first ripple of momentum. He wasn't accustomed to feeling powerless, and even the small act of sharing the burden gave him something to grasp. That evening, he tried once more to engage Madeline in conversation, this time with a more direct approach. As she moved through the parlor dusting shelves, he stepped into the room, not unkindly blocking her exit. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice calm but firm. "About the wine." She paused, cloth in hand, and met his eyes without fear. "I've also been looking through some old records. Documents from my company's history. There was a trial in Paris, many years ago. Were you there?" Madeline's face remained still. Then, slowly, she folded the cloth and placed it in her bag. "I was nearby," she said softly. "Not as a patient. Not as a worker. I was part of a group. We helped people who didn't have access to proper care. I saw what happened to them when your medications were tested without their full understanding." Her voice was neither angry nor accusatory. It held only the quiet certainty of someone who had seen what others ignored. "You think I ordered that?" Charles asked, genuinely unsure of his own defense. "I don't think you knew," Madeline replied. "But I believe you chose not to know." That struck deeper than he expected. He stood there, silent, as she moved past him and continued her work without another word. He didn't stop her. He didn't argue. He had nothing to offer in return. That night, Charles returned to his study and opened the locked cabinet. He stared at the wine bottle again. For the first time, it felt less like a mystery and more like a message. Not a threat. Not a trap, but a symbol. A question. A memory resurfaced. He remembered a meeting, years ago, when the Paris data had first arrived. A junior analyst had raised concerns about the clarity of informed consent documentation. Charles had nodded, asked for a revision, and moved on. There had been other matters: launch schedules, investor presentations, shareholder expectations. He had not investigated further. At the time, it hadn't seemed urgent. Now, in the quiet of his study, it did. Over the next several days, he continued to pull files from his archive. Letters, reports, transcripts from board meetings. Slowly, a picture began to form, not of malice, but of neglect. Not deliberate wrongdoing, but a pattern of convenient oversight. The cost of growth, the price of silence. On Thursday, when Madeline arrived again, Charles did not try to speak with her. He simply watched her work from his seat at the breakfast table. Her movements were precise, unhurried. She didn't avoid his gaze, but she didn't seek it either. There was no need. He knew now that she hadn't warned him out of fear. She had warned him out of conscience. By the end of the week, Alan called back with updates. The vineyard listed on that bottle, he said. No record of it existing. Not under that name, not in that region. Looks like the label was printed, not handwritten, even though it looks like calligraphy. Decorative, like you said. Charles felt the last piece fall into place. The wine wasn't a gift, it was a message. Designed to look like a memory, meant to spark a response. And it had. The following Monday, Charles stood before the front door longer than usual, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. The garden beyond the gravel path was soaked in golden morning light, the kind that made even ordinary things appear significant. The hedges were trimmed, the fountain gently trickling, and the gravel crisp underfoot. Everything was in place. And yet nothing felt right. He turned back toward the house, his expression more resolved than it had been in weeks. In the days since Alan's discovery, Charles had reviewed every angle, every motive, every possibility. The fabricated wine label was not just a curiosity, it was deliberate. Someone had designed it to provoke, to resurface something long buried. And there was only one person who had noticed it in time to warn him. One person who had seen through the presentation and into the danger. That someone had arrived in his life recently, quietly, and without verifiable ties. The cleaning agency that had sent Madeline had a modest office on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place Charles rarely visited, too humble, too ordinary, but he went alone. Wearing a gray coat and dark scarf, determined not to draw attention. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a polite smile, greeted him with a faint trace of recognition. When he introduced himself, she straightened her posture. "I'm looking for records on one of your staff," Charles said evenly. "Been working at my residence for several weeks. Madeline. French. She's..." The receptionist typed into her computer and frowned. "We do have her in our system. Hired less than 2 months ago. She came in person with paperwork, references, resume, identity. Documents. All in order. May I see those documents?" Charles asked. "I'm afraid I can't share personnel files, sir. Privacy policy." Charles nodded slowly. "Client? Can you at least tell me who referred her? Was there a previous?" The woman clicked again, scanning the profile. "There's a note here, says she came Recommended by a former client in France. But there's no contact listed. Just a printed letter of reference. No phone number, no address. He leaned slightly forward. Can I see that letter? She hesitated, then walked into the back room. A few minutes later, she returned with a single-page letter, printed in elegant serif font. It was written in French, signed by someone named Madame Eloise Durand. The wording was formal, precise, full of compliments. Yet as Charles read it, something gnawed at him. It lacked specifics, no mention of locations, timelines, or even surnames of patients. It was too polished. Do you have any record of contacting this woman? He asked. The receptionist shook her head. No. We took the letter at face value. It looked professional. Charles returned the paper and offered a courteous goodbye. As he stepped outside, the cold air met his face like a slap. He stood on the curb for a moment, heart pacing faster than he expected. If Madeline's reference was untraceable, and her name possibly fabricated, then she had entered his life with more intention than convenience. Back at the estate, Charles walked into the library, pulled a chair beside the fireplace, and sat without opening a book. The question had grown too large to ignore. Who was she really? And why had she chosen him? Later that afternoon, while organizing an old box of papers, Charles found a photograph from a company retreat in France nearly 2 decades earlier. He held it up to the light, scanning the familiar faces, board members, executives, partners. They were all there, frozen in mid-laughter, champagne glasses raised in the warm Parisian sun. In the background, partially obscured by shadows, stood a group of protesters behind a barricade. It had been a tense time. The release of a controversial medication had sparked small demonstrations near corporate events. Security had kept them away, and most executives had paid little attention. Charles brought the photo closer. One of the protesters was holding a sign in French, and standing next to her was a younger woman with a firm expression. Her features were unmistakable. It was Madeline. His hands trembled slightly as he lowered the photograph. The memory hit with brutal clarity. He had seen her before, not in any formal setting, not in a conference room or clinical trial, but across a cordon, holding her ground. Her presence then had gone unregistered, or perhaps deliberately forgotten. But she had remembered him. That much was now certain. The following Thursday, when Madeline arrived at 8 o'clock as usual, Charles waited in the foyer. She removed her coat slowly, hanging it on the hook with familiar precision. When she turned, he was there, photograph in hand. "You were in Paris," he said without accusation. She looked at the photo, then back at him. No surprise crossed her face. "Yes. You stood outside our retreat. You were protesting. I was supporting those who were," she replied calmly. He nodded. "So this wasn't an accident? You coming here?" "No," she said. But it wasn't an attack either. He let the silence stretch between them. Outside, a wind rustled the dry leaves across the stone path. "I needed you to remember," she continued. "People. Not just the company. Not just the decisions. Charles studied her face. There was no triumph in her expression. Only quiet insistence. "Why now?" he asked. "Because you're writing your story," she replied. "And I thought you deserved to finish it with the truth." She stepped past him gently, heading into the living room to begin her work. He didn't stop her. Charles returned to the study and pulled out the manuscript. He sat down and turned to the last page he had written. His words now seemed distant, as if written by someone else, a man wrapped in certainty, protected by distance. He picked up his pen and crossed out the last 3 lines. Then he wrote anew. He began not with profits, not with milestones, but with a face in the crowd. A silent woman, holding a sign. A voice he hadn't heard until much later. And behind that image, the slow, painful shift of a man beginning to listen. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the estate slowed further, not from inertia, but from the weight of what had been uncovered. Charles no longer saw the wine as the center of the mystery. It had done its work, it had disturbed the surface. What lay beneath was far more intricate. The photograph had confirmed that Madeline's presence in his life was deliberate. And her quiet persistence had forced him to confront what he had long buried under spreadsheets, press releases, and polished speeches. He no longer pretended to himself that this was coincidence. He understood now that the past had been summoned with purpose, and he could not ignore the call. The questions she raised, directly or indirectly, were not about policy or liability. They were about humanity, about choices made in silence that echoed louder than any public statement. One entry, however, survived, a letter from a field coordinator in a public hospital on the outskirts of Paris. The letter described patients who had not responded as predicted, who had experienced side effects that were not fully catalogued, who had spoken in hushed tones of experiments and confusion. It had been flagged for review, then archived without follow-up. Charles recognized the coordinator's name, Émilie Fournier. She had been outspoken at the time, insisting on deeper inquiry. But the company had moved ahead, citing the absence of statistically significant data. Émilie had eventually resigned. At the time, Charles had thought little of it. Now he understood that her concerns had been real, and suppressed. The more he read, the more Charles realized how easy it had been to remain shielded. He had never forged reports, never forced results. But he had accepted what was presented, rewarded compliance, and dismissed dissent. It had been enough to maintain ignorance without ever intending to deceive. The system had protected him, but it had not protected those who needed protection the most. One afternoon, a package arrived at the estate. Inside was a thin envelope marked with a French return address. There was no sender's name. Charles opened it with care. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. It showed a community clinic. Crowded, worn but alive with people. In the corner of the frame stood Madeline, much younger. In a nurse's uniform, helping an elderly man into a chair. Behind her, on a small bulletin board, was a notice that read Volontaires pour la vérité médicale. No note accompanied the photograph. No explanation. But none was needed. Charles sat in his study for hours, the photo on the desk beside him. He saw not just the young Madeline, but the conviction in her posture, the dedication in her eyes. She had not been a passerby in the crowd. She had been in the thick of it. She had borne witness. The following morning, he found her in the garden, tending to a patch of overgrown lavender. She looked up when he approached, her hands dusty with soil. "I received something," he said quietly. "A photograph. From the clinic." She said nothing, only watched him, waiting. "I remember none of this," he admitted. "Remember? I let others carry the weight. And that's part of the problem. I never bothered to." Madeline stood slowly. "Begin to see. It's not about remembering everything. It's about what you do once you." Charles nodded. "I want to see more. I want to understand what was lost, and by whom." She looked at him, as if measuring the depth of his words, then gave the faintest nod. Over the next several weeks, Charles transformed his study into a war room of recollection. Documents covered the walls, timelines were assembled, and names once forgotten returned to the forefront of his mind. He reached out to former employees, medical advisors, even journalists who had covered the trials peripherally. He was not seeking scandal, he was seeking truth. For the first time in decades, he read not with the eye of an executive, but with the conscience of a man trying to reconcile power with consequence. Some people responded with warmth. Others with distance, a few with skepticism. But none were indifferent. Charles sensed that his inquiry had stirred something beyond his own guilt, it had reopened a chapter others had also closed too quickly. One letter came from a former nurse who had worked in one of the participating hospitals. She wrote of confusion during the trial, of insufficient instructions, of patients who didn't fully grasp what they had agreed to. Her tone was not accusatory, but weary. She thanked Charles for reaching out, and for trying, at last, to understand. Another message arrived from the daughter of a patient who had died shortly after participating in the trial. She included a scanned journal her mother had kept. The entries were sparse but haunting, short notes about symptoms, anxiety, and hope. The last page bore only one sentence: "I hope this helps someone." Charles read the line over and over. He folded the printout, placed it gently beside Madeline's photograph, and turned off the lamp. He did not cry. He did not speak. But for the first time, he felt the full weight of what his work had meant, not in reports or earnings, but in lives touched and altered. The legacy he had long been proud of was more complicated now. It was not ruined, but it was raw, and real. That night, he began a new chapter in his manuscript. He did not call it, "The Trials in Paris." He called it, "The Silence Between Us." And he wrote not to defend, not to justify, but to witness. The library had become something of a sanctuary for Charles, though not in the traditional sense. It was no longer a place of calm reflection, nor a retreat from the world. It had evolved into a space of confrontation, where memory was tested and truth invited in with no promise of comfort. Papers littered the desk in uneven stacks, margins scrawled with annotations, timelines branching like veins across the chalkboard he had pulled from storage. And there, in the center of it all, lay the manuscript, no longer a tale of success, but of revelation. Madeline entered that morning without a word, as she always did. She carried the same tote bag, wore the same neutral blouse and long skirt, and moved with the same grace and intent. But something between them had shifted. The air, though quiet, was no longer weighed down by avoidance. Charles waited until she had finished dusting the far wall before speaking. "I found her journal," he said, voice even. "Copies of the pages. It's not long, but it's enough. The daughter of one of the patients. She sent me." Madeline turned. She didn't ask whose journal. She didn't need to. She wrote that she hoped it would help someone. Charles continued. She just hoped. She didn't know who. Madeline crossed the room slowly, placing her bag beside the bookshelf. She remained standing, eyes on the edge of the desk. "You helped shape something large," she said. "Something global. But the larger the machine, the easier it becomes to forget its parts are made of people." He nodded. "I didn't forget. I never saw them in the first place." There was a moment of silence, not heavy, but full. Madeline stepped forward and gently took a seat across from him. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed ready to speak not as an employee, but as someone with a story of her own. I was 19 when I joined the volunteer group. She began. It wasn't political at first. Just an effort to help those who fell through the cracks. Elderly patients, immigrants, people who didn't trust hospitals. We offered translation, transportation, sometimes just a place to sit and be heard. Charles listened, unmoving. I didn't know about the trials at first. She continued. We only started noticing when patients began coming back confused, tired, speaking of meetings they didn't remember agreeing to. One woman showed us a consent form she couldn't read. She thought she was signing up for extra care. Charles's throat tightened. He had read about consent forms, had seen them approved by legal teams. But reading them in conference rooms was not the same as seeing them misunderstood. In waiting rooms, we tried to raise questions. Madeline said. But who listens to students and part-time volunteers? We weren't experts. We were dismissed. Eventually, the program ended, the attention moved on, and people were left with stories no one wanted to hear. And you? Charles asked, his voice quieter now. I left the group eventually. She replied. But not the memories. I moved on with my life. Built a new one. But when I saw your name again, when I saw the interviews about your retirement, your legacy, the memoir, I realized you still didn't know. Or worse, that you had chosen not to. I didn't know. He said. But I did choose not to ask. She nodded. That's why I came. Not to punish you. But to give you the chance to ask now. Charles looked down at the pages before him. The manuscript he had started had no resemblance to what it had become. The man who began writing it no longer existed, not in the same way. I've spent my life building things, he said. Spend my final years dismantling them. Systems. Frameworks. Products. I never thought I'd. Madeline stood and walked to the window. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently. Not dismantling anything. You're illuminating it. There's a difference. He followed her gaze but saw only his reflection in the glass, the shape of an older man. Humbled by time. I want to do more than write. He said. I want to understand. Help. Repair. She turned back to him. Then listen. And let the listening be the first act. Charles spent the rest of the day reading over the letters that had come in from former staff, patients' families, and a few anonymous notes left at his gate. Most were cautious. A few were angry. But some were open-hearted, written by those who saw his inquiry not as redemption, but as recognition. That evening, he called Alan again. I need contacts, Charles said. People from the old trial teams. Doctors, nurses, coordinators. I don't want to clear my name. I want to understand what really happened. Alan hesitated, then said. I think you've already started. The next morning, Charles invited Madeline to walk the grounds with him. It was a clear day. Brisk but not cruel. They walked slowly along the garden path, past the old fountain and the trimmed hedges. There was no agenda. Just presence. I used to think legacies were about scale, Charles said. Direction. Size. Reach. But maybe it's about. Madeline smiled faintly. Around. Direction can only change when you stop long enough to turn. They walked in silence for a while. When they returned to the porch, Charles opened the door. For her. I'll be rewriting everything. He said. From the beginning. I think that's exactly what needs to happen. She replied. And for the first time since she arrived, she stayed for tea. The days that followed marked a subtle but profound transformation in Charles's household. The quiet that once cloaked every hallway with passive stillness now bore a different quality, an awareness, almost a shared understanding. It was no longer a silence built from avoidance or distance, but one formed from reflection. Charles moved through his routines with the same discipline, yet with more intentionality. His morning coffee was no longer consumed absent-mindedly. His walks around the estate were no longer mere exercise but moments of introspection. The presence of Madeline, no longer seen as peripheral, now grounded his days in a reality he had neglected for too long. Each morning after breakfast, he would return to the study where the manuscript had begun its second life. It was no longer a self-congratulatory chronicle of business milestones, but a reckoning, a confession in prose, unpolished but honest. Page after page grew heavier with memories, once buried, now restored. He recounted conversations he had brushed aside. Reports he had approved without enough scrutiny, decisions made under pressure that favored speed over care. What emerged was not a tale of corruption, but of convenience. The small compromises that accumulated, not as crimes, but as blind habits. Yet words, Charles knew, were not enough. Remorse was essential, but insufficient on its own. One afternoon, as the wind picked up and scattered dry leaves across the gravel path, he sat at his desk staring at an envelope addressed to a former board member. It was the fourth letter he had written that week. Not letters of blame or confrontation, but of inquiry. He wanted them to look back, as he had. Not to assign guilt, but to acknowledge the contours of their shared choices. Some responded quickly, others not at all. A few expressed surprise, a few discomfort. But a handful responded with stories of their own, regrets, buried suspicions, confessions of looking the other way. Charles read each letter slowly, as if absorbing a shared language that had never been spoken aloud. One message came from a former medical liaison who had quietly resigned after internal concerns were dismissed. She thanked Charles for reopening the conversation, and wrote that even now, years later, she carried the burden of patience she felt she had failed. In response, Charles wrote only one sentence: "You were not alone in your silence, but you do not have to be alone in your remembering." He began compiling names, patients, field workers, local doctors. With Madeline's help, he started forming a list of organizations that had worked in the shadows to help those affected by pharmaceutical negligence. Some were still active, still fighting the same battles. Others had faded into obscurity, underfunded and exhausted. Charles began reaching out, offering not apologies but support. He made calls, set up quiet meetings, donated anonymously. He wanted no headlines, no articles. He asked for no interviews. His only request was that the help go where it was needed. The first checks were issued to small clinics in rural areas of France. Then to translation services for medical paperwork. Then to counseling centers offering assistance to trial participants who never received closure. One afternoon, Charles and Madeline sat on the back terrace, the scent of lavender rising from the garden beds below. She watched him as he signed another envelope. "You're doing this quietly," she said. "I've spoken enough in public." He replied. "This isn't for reputation. It's for repair." She nodded, understanding. That same week, Charles asked Judith, his assistant, to help organize a series of personal calls. He wanted to speak to every retired physician he had worked with during the European expansion. One by one, he listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. Some offered memories he had forgotten. Others offered silence broken only by sighs. But in each voice, there was a release, the slow unraveling of things too long contained. Later, Charles sat before the manuscript and began writing a new chapter titled The Cost of Absence. He described, in unflinching detail, the ways decisions ripple beyond sight. He wrote, not as an authority, but as a student, of error, of memory, of consequence. The act of writing became not just a record, but a form of restitution. In the evenings, he and Madeline often spoke over tea, their conversations no longer guarded or sparse. She shared more of her time in France, the volunteers she had known, the small victories that never made headlines. He listened with care, asking questions that once would have felt beneath him. And in doing so, something softened, not just in him, but between them. One evening, as the light faded from the sky, Charles stood at the threshold of his study and looked back at the desk, the papers, the photographs. He saw not just the work of one man, but the beginning of a different path. That night, he drafted a letter addressed not to a person, but to a future reader. It was meant for inclusion at the end of his book. It read, in part, to whoever finds this story, I offer not a perfect account, but a sincere one. I believed, once, that progress was its own justification. But progress without conscience leaves too many behind. This is not an apology for the past. It is a conversation with it. May we all have the courage to ask what we chose not to see, and to act when we finally do. He signed it simply, and tucked it between the final pages. The following morning, as the sun broke through the window and painted the hardwood floor in gold, Charles rose from his chair with renewed purpose. He looked out over the grounds, past the trimmed hedges and gravel paths, toward the distant woods. He didn't yet know where this new journey would lead. But for the first time in years, he understood why it had to begin. The morning air had grown crisper, and the trees along the estate's edge had begun to lose their final leaves. A gentle wind carried the scent of earth and wood, a signal that winter was near. Charles stood by the window in the dining room, looking out over the garden. The table behind him remained untouched, the toast cooling on its plate, the tea gone lukewarm. The newspaper was folded neatly beside the tray, unread. His thoughts had drifted far beyond headlines. Something had changed in him. Not gradually, but with the steady insistence of someone realizing they had missed too many chances to act. He had spent much of his life reacting, strategizing, defending, explaining. But now, with no board to report to, no investors to appease, and no empire to protect, he had only his conscience to answer to. And that voice was no longer willing to be silenced. He turned from the window and walked purposefully to the study. The manuscript lay open where he had left it the night before, flanked by files, letters, and the familiar photograph of Madeline as a young volunteer. But instead of continuing his writing, he sat back and opened his laptop. There was another task to begin, one not of words, but of action. He started with a list, names of independent medical organizations, ethical research initiatives, clinics focused on transparency in pharmaceutical education. Some he had heard of during his career, often as background noise during regulatory reviews. Others were new to him, mentioned in the letters and emails he had received over recent weeks. With Judith's help, he began establishing a framework, a small, focused initiative to offer funding, resources, and awareness to groups advocating for ethical reform in medical research. It was not about rewriting history. It was about building something better forward. He named the project not after himself, nor his company, but after a phrase from one of the journal entries he had read weeks before, the quiet choice. It seemed fitting, modest, but deliberate. As the weeks passed, he formalized the initiative with legal advisors, ensured full transparency of its structure, and created avenues for independent oversight. He requested nothing in return. No commemorative plaques, no keynote invitations. His only condition was that recipients remain autonomous, and that every penny be traceable to outcomes, not appearances. During this time, Madeline remained a steady presence in the house. Their conversations had grown more fluid, often extending beyond their original silences. She never offered praise, never exaggerated encouragement. But her calm attention told him everything he needed to know. She saw the shift, and more importantly, she trusted it. One afternoon, Charles invited her into the study to show her the outline of the quiet choice. He described the partnerships forming, the grants being drafted, the organizations agreeing to join the advisory circle. He did not speak of redemption. He spoke of responsibility. She listened without interruption, eyes scanning the documents as he described the structure. When he finished, she looked at him with a quiet steadiness. "This is not what I expected when I walked into this house," she said. "It's not what I expected either," he replied. They stood for a moment in mutual silence. No explanation was needed. Later that week, Charles reached out to a small advocacy group in France composed of former trial participants and their families. He offered to fund a translation and literacy initiative focused on helping vulnerable patients understand clinical consent forms. The group accepted with guarded gratitude. A week after the grant was approved, he received a handwritten letter from one of the participants, a woman who had once believed she was receiving free routine care, only to realize later she had been part of a trial. The letter was brief but powerful. "Does. Merci. I did not know my voice mattered," it read. "But now I see it." Charles held the letter for several minutes before folding it carefully and placing it inside his notebook. It wasn't validation. It was connection. The quiet acknowledgement of a long-delayed recognition. He expanded his outreach next, contacting independent auditors and former compliance officers with reputations for integrity. He asked them to review the records of the quiet choice every quarter. He wanted the initiative to be built on the exact opposite of what had once allowed his company to overlook its impact: no opacity, no assumptions, no unchecked authority. At night, when he returned to his manuscript, the tone had changed again. The chapters no longer centered on him. They became stories of others, of those unseen, unheard, and too often uncounted. Each sentence sought to illuminate rather than to center. He found a new kind of peace in that, the kind born not of vindication, but of clarity. Madeline remained in the house, her work unchanged in its rhythm, but now marked by small signs of comfort. She no longer moved through the rooms with complete distance. Occasionally, she paused to comment on the garden, the wind, or the smell of the library's old wood. One evening, she brought Charles a book of essays by medical ethicists from her time in France. She placed it on the side table without explanation. He opened it that night and read deep into the morning. By the start of December, the Quiet Choice had begun issuing its first round of grants. Charles held the official report in his hand as he stood again at the window, looking out at the bare trees. He had once believed that legacy was a monument. Now, he saw it more as a thread, something passed forward, fragile and precise, but capable of binding stories that had once been scattered. He returned to his desk and placed the report beside the manuscript. Then, with a calm resolve, he picked up his pen and continued writing. Not to conclude a story, but to make space for one that had too long been waiting to begin. The letter had arrived on a Wednesday morning, postmarked from New York, printed on heavy cream paper bearing the embossed logo of the Whitmore Foundation, the philanthropic offshoot that had been established shortly after Charles's retirement. He had not heard from them in nearly a year. Though he was still listed as founder and honorary chairman, he had stepped away from all formal operations after the sale of the company. The letter was formal, courteous, and direct. The foundation would be hosting its annual winter gala in mid-December, a gathering of former board members, executives, donors, and new leaders in the medical innovation sector. Charles's presence was requested, if not expected. He held the letter for several minutes, rereading the words, studying the tone. It bore none of the warmth of personal invitation, nor the caution of those aware of his recent efforts. It was a summons wrapped in etiquette, a reminder that while he had stepped away, the world he had built was still moving forward without him. He left the envelope on his desk and made no decision that day. 2 days later, he mentioned it to Madeline during their now regular tea on the terrace. "They want you back," she said, with a hint of irony. "Not back," Charles replied. "Just present. A reminder that the name still carries weight." "And will you go?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sipped his tea and watched a squirrel dart through the garden. "I think I need to," he said finally. "Not for them. For myself." The night of the gala arrived with a bitter chill. Charles wore a charcoal suit and an old wool coat that still held the scent of cedar. Madeline did not accompany him, though she offered a subtle nod as he stepped into the car that had come to collect him. The city was glittering with holiday lights, the streets alive with motion, and the building that housed the gala was dressed in crystal and silver, full of the soft clink of glass and the low hum of conversation. Inside, the faces were familiar, older, perhaps a touch more polished, but unmistakably part of the world Charles had once ruled. There were handshakes, smiles, nods of recognition. Some approached with genuine pleasure, others with caution, a few with polite distance. He returned each greeting with measured warmth, neither too open nor evasive. As the evening progressed, he drifted between groups, listening more than speaking. The topics were familiar: market trends, new trials, regulatory shifts, digital integration. There was little mention of ethics, and none of the quiet wounds he had spent the last months addressing. It was a room of progress, defined by confidence and forward motion. Near the end of the evening, he found himself approached by Jonathan Hale, a former board member and longtime corporate strategist. Jonathan had always been smooth, persuasive, and unflinchingly pragmatic. "Charles," he said with practiced charm, "I was wondering when I'd see you tonight. I debated whether to come." Charles replied honestly. "Well, I'm glad you did. Your presence still carries weight. And from what I've heard, you've been busy reaching out to old contacts, stirring conversations." "That's one way to put it," Charles said. Jonathan leaned slightly closer. "Listen, I'll be frank. Some people are concerned. This new tone of yours, it raises questions. About responsibility. About legacy. We all admire introspection, of course, but we also have to protect the work we've done. The public doesn't always understand nuance." Charles met his gaze evenly. Understanding it fully. I'm not interested in rewriting the past. But I am interested in. Jonathan gave a thin smile. Closed. There's understanding, and then there's opening old doors best left. Some of those doors never should have been closed. Charles said quietly. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Jonathan chuckled softly. Still the idealist, even now. No. Charles replied. The truth. That's the difference. I'm not the idealist anymore. I'm just not afraid of. Later, as the speeches began and the room quieted, Charles stood near the back, out of the spotlight. The new chairwoman spoke of innovation, resilience, and the future. His name was mentioned once, politely, briefly, among a list of honored guests. There was applause, and he nodded graciously, but he felt no pride. Only clarity. After the event, he did not linger. He stepped outside into the cold, refusing the offer of a car. He walked for several blocks, letting the city noise wash over him. Somewhere behind the tall glass windows, the world of his past continued spinning, measured, strategic, efficient. But outside, among strangers and headlights and wind, he felt lighter. When he returned home just after midnight, the house was dark, save for the reading lamp in the study. He removed his coat, walked quietly to his desk, and resumed writing. He began a new section, titled simply, The Rooms We Built. He wrote about power, not as corruption, but as insulation. About decisions made with distance, and the price of that distance. He described the gala in exacting detail, the lighting, the colors, the warmth of the wine against the chill of the room. He captured the way old colleagues smiled with calculation, the way some averted their eyes. He noted his own surprise at how little anger he felt, only a growing sense of purpose. The final lines of the chapter read, You cannot mourn what you refuse to look at. And you cannot change what you will not name. Tonight, I saw the past not as a shadow, but as a mirror. And I stood in front of it, no longer afraid of the reflection. When he finally went to bed, the wind had picked up outside, rattling the shutters gently. But inside the house, everything was still. Not silent. Not empty. Just still, with the kind of calm that follows when one has chosen not to run. Winter arrived fully, blanketing the estate in snow that softened the outlines of the landscape. And hushed even the wind. The trees stood still, their limbs frosted and bare, and the gravel paths that once echoed underfoot were now silent beneath layers of white. Charles had always admired winter for its ability to reset the world, to reduce the unnecessary to the essential. This year, the season mirrored the quiet transformation within him. The manuscript was nearly complete. What had begun as a personal memoir had become something else entirely, part confession, part chronicle, part offering. He had no illusions about it changing the world, but he knew, without doubt, that it had changed him. More than once, he considered abandoning the project altogether. Yet each time he paused, a new letter would arrive, a new voice from the past would find its way to him, and he would return to the desk. It was no longer a duty. It was a dialogue. Word of his actions had begun to circulate. Quietly at first, then more openly. A former journalist who had covered the pharmaceutical sector in Europe reached out for an interview. Charles declined, preferring his actions to speak louder than any public statement. Still, the story found its way into professional circles. It was not scandalous enough for headlines, but intriguing enough to spark discussion. A few saw it as a noble gesture. Others, predictably, saw it as performative. He did not respond to either view. He stayed the course. Invitations began to arrive, requests to speak at academic conferences, to join ethics panels, to consult on transparency initiatives. Charles declined most of them. But one, from a small medical university in Lyon, gave him pause. The invitation was handwritten by a professor who had once been a student volunteer during the Paris trials. She remembered the confusion, the fear among her peers, and the feeling of powerlessness. She had since dedicated her career to medical ethics and education. In her letter, she wrote, "If there is value in your journey, let it be shared not with the powerful, but with those still learning how to use power." Charles read the letter several times before placing it beside the photograph of Madeleine in her volunteer days. He accepted the invitation. The lecture was modest, no cameras, no broadcasts, just a room of students and faculty seated in a semicircle. Charles spoke not from a podium, but from a chair among them. He shared excerpts from his writing, described the decisions he had once considered too small to matter, and the consequences that proved otherwise. He spoke of silence, not as malice, but as habit. Of responsibility, not as punishment, but as attention. And he told them about the woman who had come into his life quietly and asked him, with no demands, to remember. There was no applause when he finished. Just a long silence, and then, one by one, questions. Thoughtful, sincere, sometimes uncomfortable. Charles answered them all. When he returned to Connecticut, the house felt different. Not because of the weather, or the holidays approaching, but because he had begun to see it not as a retreat, but as a place of convergence. A space where the past and future met in dialogue. Madeleine greeted him with her usual nod, but something in her eyes had changed, a recognition, perhaps, that he had stepped further into the world she once represented. That evening, he invited several local medical students and young researchers to the estate. He had no agenda for them, no speeches. He simply opened the doors, prepared a meal with the help of the cook, and created a space for conversation. They spoke about their studies, their frustrations with bureaucracy, their hopes for more humane systems. Charles listened, not as a mentor, but as a witness. Their energy reminded him of a version of himself before the layers of success began to dull his sense of urgency. Over the next few weeks, these gatherings continued. Sometimes formal, other times impromptu. Word spread, and slowly, a new rhythm took hold. The estate, once a symbol of retreat, became a place of reflection and exchange. Researchers brought their notes. Health workers brought their stories. Charles offered questions more often than answers. One night, as a snowstorm blanketed the region and cancelled several planned visits, Charles and Madeleine sat alone by the fire. The silence between them was now warm, no longer tense. Or unfinished. "You've turned this place into something different," she said. "I think it turned me first," he replied. She looked at the fire for a long time before speaking again. "Adjust." "But you changed." "Most people don't change. They." Charles considered that for a moment. "Because someone gave me reason to." She nodded, accepting his words not as praise, but as acknowledgement. The following morning, he met with an advisor to discuss the expansion of the Quiet Choice. They would add a new branch focused solely on medical education, funding scholarships, hosting ethics workshops, and building resources for underserved communities. Charles insisted the program be led by those closest to the ground, former volunteers, nurses, translators. He had learned enough to know that insight does not trickle down, it grows from proximity. By the end of January, the first students funded through the initiative had begun there. Internships. Letters arrived from their mentors, describing their diligence, their sensitivity, their hunger to do better. Charles read each one slowly, then filed them beside the journal entries and testimonies that had reshaped his understanding of legacy. He no longer thought of the estate as an inheritance, but as a platform. Not a monument, but a passage. And as he stood once more by the window, watching the young pines collect snow on their thin branches, he felt something close to peace, not because the past had been corrected, but because the future, at last, had a new kind of momentum. The snow had begun to melt in quiet rivulets along the edges of the stone steps, tracing thin lines of water across the worn paths that led from the house to the gardens. The trees remained bare, but the promise of spring was already forming in the softened soil and the returning chirp of morning birds. Charles walked the grounds with a slower gait than usual, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the horizon as though trying to read something written on the air. The house behind him was not just a residence anymore. It had become a vessel, a gathering point of memory, of testimony, of a vision that was still taking shape. The manuscript was finished. It sat on his desk in a single bound volume, its cover plain, its title understated, Margins and Molecules, A Personal Reckoning. There had been offers to publish from old acquaintances in the industry and a few progressive editorial houses. But Charles had declined them all, at least for now. The book was not written for exposure or acclaim. It was written to remember, to invite others to remember, and to begin again with greater care. He had decided instead to send printed copies to those who had shaped its pages, knowingly or not. Families of patients, former employees, the young students who now gathered weekly at the estate to share their research. Each copy was accompanied by a handwritten note. Not an explanation. Not an apology. Just a quiet acknowledgement of connection. The house had also changed in more visible ways. What had once been unused guest rooms were now filled with visiting fellows, researchers passing through on temporary study retreats, and young professionals developing projects funded by the quiet choice. The long dining room table, once reserved for formal occasions, now hosted vibrant meals where discussions flowed easily between laughter and seriousness. There was talk of new models for informed consent, of rebuilding trust in medical systems, of stories from the field. Charles rarely led these conversations. He preferred to listen, to offer questions that pushed clarity, and to observe how easily insight flowed when hierarchy was removed. One of the more transformative projects came from a group of students who proposed building an open-access digital archive of patient narratives from global clinical trials, stories told in their own voices, translated and annotated not for academic study, but for public understanding. Charles backed the project immediately. It reminded him of the journals he had read, of the woman who had written, "I hope this helps someone." The Foundation's resources, once tied up in conservative investments and philanthropic theater, were now redirected into transparent streams, tracked, audited, and publicly reported. Every dollar had a destination. Every destination had a name. And every name, Charles insisted, had a story. He no longer attended large events or industry galas. He turned down invitations to speak at high-profile conferences. When people asked for statements or endorsements, he offered referrals to those doing the actual work. He had spent enough time at the center. Now he preferred the periphery, where real change often began unnoticed. Madeline continued to work at the estate, though her role had long shifted from that of an employee to something more intimate, more grounded in mutual respect. She now co-led Discussion circles with visiting students, sharing not only her past but her perspective on how systems fail, and how communities endure. Her presence anchored the space in lived truth. And Charles often deferred to her when questions arose that required more than theory. One afternoon, as they walked the garden path together, Charles paused near the edge of the property where a new greenhouse had been installed, an initiative proposed by a young ecologist exploring plant-based medicinal studies. He watched the students inside, their hands moving among seedlings and tools, unaware of being observed. "This place is no longer mine," he said quietly. Madeline looked at him, then at the greenhouse. "It never should have been," she replied. He smiled, not as a retort but as a recognition. In the months that followed, the estate began hosting retreats for organizations dedicated to ethical health policy, cultural translation in clinical communication, and patient rights education. These gatherings were quiet, intentional, often intergenerational. Charles participated as a host, not a guide. His role was to hold the door open, nothing more. On the anniversary of his retirement, now years removed, he received a letter from the CEO who had succeeded him. It was professional, respectful, and cautious. The company had seen the shifts, the publications, the growing ripple of Charles's efforts. There was concern, curiosity, and perhaps a touch of defensiveness. Charles wrote back a single paragraph. "Our industry was built on miracles and margins. But miracles without accountability become myths. And margins without ethics become debts. I am no longer defending a legacy. I am building a future." No reply came, and he expected none. That spring, Charles established a permanent fellowship in Madeline's name. It was designed for individuals who had once been excluded from formal education, volunteers, community caregivers, local advocates, those whose knowledge came not from classrooms but from experience. The program offered training, travel, translation, and publication support. Within weeks, applications arrived from 5 continents. When Charles announced the fellowship to a circle of students one morning, he read the description aloud, then handed the floor to Madeline. She stood calmly, then simply said, "Some voices do not rise because the system was not built to carry them. This fellowship is not a gift. It is an invitation to rise anyway." Applause followed, but Charles watched her expression instead. There was no pride, only stillness. The kind that comes when something long overdue has finally arrived. That evening, he sat again by the window in the study, the manuscript beside him, the fireplace flickering low. Outside, the trees had begun to bud. The snow was gone, replaced by soft earth and green beginnings. He picked up his pen and began writing a final letter, not to anyone in particular, but to the future inheritors of the work. This was never about absolution. It was about attention. We must become attentive not only to data, but to dignity. To results, but also to realities. I leave behind not a name, not a building, but a practice, to pause, to ask, to remember. And in that remembering, to repair. He signed the page and placed it at the end of the manuscript. The legacy was no longer an echo of what had been. It had become a seed of what could still be. The morning light filtered softly through the study window, casting elongated patterns across the desk where the manuscript lay closed. It was no longer just a stack of pages, it had become a vessel of transformation, a record of shifts both internal and external. Charles stood beside it in silence, one hand resting gently on the cover, the other holding a letter addressed not to a boardroom, nor a publisher, but to himself. A final message written in his own hand, folded carefully and sealed with no intention of ever being mailed. The house was quiet, not in the hollow way of solitude, but in the rich stillness of completion. Outside, the garden had come fully alive with the arrival of spring. The young trees planted the year before had begun to bloom, and the greenhouse beyond the hedges now stood at the center of a modest ecosystem of collaboration, research, and quiet resilience. Madeline moved through the rooms with her familiar grace. Her role had long since shifted beyond domestic rhythm. She was, to those who visited, a guide. Not in title, not in structure, but in presence. She offered orientation not in procedures but in stories, short reflections shared over tea, memories held without embellishment. She never spoke of her first day there. Never described the moment she whispered in French to a man who had nearly opened a bottle of wine that did not belong to him. She understood that its meaning had already taken root in ways that could not be contained in a single retelling. That afternoon, Charles hosted one last gathering in the main hall. The room had been rearranged into a circle, without podiums or formality. Chairs were brought in from every corner of the house, filled with voices that had grown into the heart of the estate's new life: students, researchers, translators, caretakers, and others whose names would never appear on company rosters but whose labor had shaped lives just the same. He stood to speak, not with notes or a rehearsed address, but with something closer to farewell. "There is a moment," he began, "to remember. When a man must choose not how to be remembered, but how." He paused, letting the words find their place. "I began writing to document. Then I wrote to reckon. Now, I write no more. What matters from here is not what I say, but what we carry. This house, these rooms, these stories, they belong to all of you now. It's not an archive. It's a dialogue. It lives only if you keep asking questions." He sat down, not in ceremony, but in conclusion. The group responded not with clapping, but with the kind of silence that held agreement. A silence full of breath, of thought, of collective recognition. Later that evening, Charles and Madeline stood together on the back terrace, overlooking the garden paths. The wind was light, carrying the scent of jasmine and soil, a reminder that cycles were always unfolding. "I won't stay here much longer," he said quietly. "You don't have to," she replied. "The measure of the work. You've built something that doesn't need you to stay. That's..." He nodded, grateful not for her approval, but for her truth. In the weeks that followed, Charles began the process of stepping back. The foundation now had its own leadership, drawn from the very people who had helped shape its mission. The estate remained open, restructured into a year-round residency program and ethical dialogue retreat. The study, once reserved for his private work, was converted into a shared space, a library, a reading room, a place for pause. The manuscript, bound in linen and placed without fanfare on a central shelf, was left there with no inscription. On his final morning at the estate, Charles rose early. He made his coffee, as he always had, and walked the garden path one last time. The sky was soft with light. The flowers had opened just enough to catch the wind. He stopped near the stone bench beneath the oak tree, the same spot where he had once sat wondering why a stranger had warned him not to drink a gift he didn't remember receiving. He sat again, this time with clarity, and allowed the memory to return, not as a question, but as the beginning of a turning. A car waited at the front drive. A modest bag sat in the back seat. He had not planned where to go next, only that he would keep moving forward. There were still people to meet, still places to listen, still work to do that did not require control, only presence. As he reached for the car door, Madeline appeared in the doorway. She said nothing, simply raised one hand in farewell. Charles returned the gesture. The road ahead was lined with green, soft curves, and endless possibility. And somewhere, tucked inside his coat pocket, was a card, the last page of the manuscript he had rewritten more times than he could count. On it, just one line, printed in his own hand. To the woman who reminded me that silence can be an invitation. He placed it over his heart, closed the door gently, and left behind not a house, but a legacy. Transformed.